I'd like to call the meeting of the Committee of the Whole for Monday, May 13, 2024 to order. I'd ask that you please join me and rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Clerk Tamer, call the roll, please.
Brennan.
Here.
Irby.
Here.
Joyder. Here. Remus. Hill.
Here.
Schenko. Here. Jensen.
Here.
Bram.
Here.
Cahill.
Here.
Toludo. Here. Park.
Here.
Udera.
Here.
Vestito. Here. Nardini.
Here.
14 present, 0 absent.
14 present, 0 absent. We have a quorum. Item 2, announcements. Are there any announcements from the dais this evening? Seeing none, we'll move into public comments. Is there, Clerk Tamer, is anyone signed up for public comment for
Nobody
this meeting?
signed in there.
All right, and is there anyone in the audience who did not have the opportunity to sign in but would like to make public comment? Seeing none, we'll move on to the business before the committee, which is the capital budgeting overview. By way of introduction, I don't think in my years on council we've ever done something quite like this. And as I've said, for new aldermen, and meaning maybe up to even 6 years or more, you might sit in our budget process and we go through the capital budget. And by the time we start moving into the operating budget, and maybe then you start realizing the tie into the capital budget, we have had a number of projects that we've been discussing that have capital budget implications, and we will probably be talking about them a lot more specifically and in detail when we get into the budget season for our 2025 budget, which, as you will see as part of the presentation, really is not that far off, at least in terms of staff development and working with committee chairs and perhaps with me as well. So this is intended to be educational so that we are all knowledgeable about how the capital budget works, what it does, how it ties into our plans for the future, the roles of staff, the roles of the council. And I expect that as we go into the 2025 budget year process that we will probably have more robust participation in looking at what staff is recommending as capital budget priorities and making sure that the council is in alignment. And that would include setting priorities for the capital budget, which has implications for not only 2025, but years to come. I do not want to get into, and we are not going to talk about specific priorities, whether it's going to be the train station versus the police station versus lead pipe removal versus whatever. The purpose for this is to set the table so that we can then have the discussion later. So staff has put together a very fine presentation. I know that Chair Toludo put in some review and comment to make it better, and Alderman Nardini spent a lot of time reading it and asked some questions and pointed some things out, and I know he read it because he saw a typo in there. So, and so I think thank you both, because I think that's going to help make this a better presentation. So with that, City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, City Council. I want to thank Christina Coyle and her team, along with Stan Balicki and Kent Johnson, who had input on the draft presentation as well. If you did not get a chance to check Board Docs, we did post this on Board Docs, so you can follow along on your laptops if you choose to. So this presentation is based on the presentation that I make to City Council each fall. Coincides with the letter from September 14th of 2023, and of course goes along with the KEB pages towards the back of your budget book. So with that, we'll get started. And so the Mayor asked us to put together, as I said, or as he said, a capital budgeting 101 presentation, just as kind of an overview explanation. So we got into some more detail than I typically would in a city council presentation. And of course, you always start with, well, what is the 5-year capital expenditure budget? I'm going to reverse these 2 points because the KEB is a long-term financial planning tool for us, which helps us identify and plan for city projects. As Mayor said, there's a number of them on there. They increase and decrease or ebb and flow as projects come off or perhaps rise in the rates as we perhaps receive grant funding for something like that. And so the objective is to identify and create that comprehensive plan for those long-range major capital expenditures that are necessary to run the city day to day and year to year. So as I said, the KEB is a planning tool. It is not the annual budget. The operating budget is the annual budget, and not all projects in the KEB are put into the operating budget each year. It depends on a lot of things like priorities and funding, mostly. So to be included in the KEB, it's an expenditure of $25,000 or more that results in the acquisition or construction of fixed assets that are intended to be held or used for a period of 10 years or more, and that aligns with the city's capitalization policy. The expenditure areas include street and sidewalk programs, the municipal utility, which of course is water and sewer, our stormwater fund, our buildings, major equipment, and others including vehicles, software, electrical, etc. And so that I don't bore you too much tonight, I'm going to hand this over to Christina every now and then so that you can have a change of pace.
All right, so next I'm going to walk through the different city funds that are included in the KEB, explain a little bit about what each fund does, what it pays for, and then also talk about what can each city fund pay for and what can't it pay for. So highlight some of those items, and certainly I think Manager Grabowski and I talked, if there are questions during the presentation, you can feel free to ask them. So each project in the KEB has to be funded by one of the city's funds. Most of the city's funds have some capital component to them. And so below is just a list divided by enterprise funds and governmental funds. I'll explain a little bit more in detail as we move through the slides what the differences are. But we have enterprise funds and we have governmental capital funds that pay for the projects in the KEB, or those projects are housed in those funds, and the different funds based off of what type of fund they are have different restrictions or different purposes that we need to be mindful of when we are thinking about what we are using that fund to pay for, because we not only have to know where does this project expense belong, but what are the options to pay for different project expenses. So it'll make more sense as I go into the different funds and talk about them in more detail. So the first group of funds I'm going to talk about are what are called our enterprise funds, and they are really meant to be run as an enterprise. The name speaks for itself. So think of each enterprise fund as its own business or subsidiary of the city. It is meant to be self-sustaining, such that there are user rates and charges that are raised to meet all of the expenses for the fund. So not only operating expenses, but capital and debt service expenses. Now there are exceptions to that, and we certainly have that in the city of Elmhurst. You know, there are some funds that do help support our enterprise funds. So a great example is our TIF funds. We'll get into this a little bit later too, but our TIF funds do provide some support for TIF eligible projects that are related to some of our enterprise funds, to our parking fund or to our municipal utility fund. So our municipal utility fund in 2024, our MUF fund is the fund that pays for our water, sewer, and wastewater services for the city and the associated capital projects. There was $46.2 million in capital projects in 2024. The largest project contained within that is the Bundle 5 project at the wastewater utility plant. There is $4.7 million budgeted for debt service. The majority of that is IEPA loans that we have taken out for various projects. There is a small amount of general obligation bonds that is included in that as well. The cost to do the projects in the municipal utility fund is borne by user rates and charges. So 95% of the revenue that comes into the MUF is those rates and charges. And the city council discussed and increased the water and sewer rates this year to respond to the growing capital need that we have in the MUF fund. There is
Director Coyle? Thanks. I appreciate you letting me ask a question. In a vacuum, in an enterprise fund that was in surplus, would that surplus be allowed to be spent anywhere, or do enterprise funds, again, in the hypothetical situation that there was a surplus, are those surplus dollars restricted to enterprise expenses?
So the surplus dollars for an enterprise fund should be retained within that enterprise fund because they were paid for by the user rates and charges. You know, users paid into the utility fund, they paid their water bill, they paid their sewer bill, expecting it to maintain the that fund and that utility. Now there are some ways that the city does share expenses. So a great example is, I'll use the finance department, right? There's a function of the finance department, this isn't capital, but there's a function of the finance department that, provides water billing. So there are staffing costs that are allocated to the MUF because they are providing MUF services. So it's a holistic city cost that we can allocate. Another example is, part of the asphalt patching project that you'll see in the CAB is divided both between the general fund and the MUF because there's patching involved when you go in and you repair a water main or you repair a main break. So that's a cost that may be thought of more as a general fund cost, but can be also seen in the MUF.
Thanks.
And lastly, on this slide, the CERC fee for the MUF specifically pays for the.
Coyle?
Sorry.
Can I just respond to that? I would just add on top of what Director Coyle said, if a enterprise fund has a surplus above the reserve goal, they should reduce rates because you have too much money
Right.
for that system's needs.
True.
Let me know when that happens.
Yeah, I would love to see that happen, but
All right.
So the CERC fee pays specifically for the MUF debt service that you would see in your water and sewer bill.
Mayor. Alderman Brennan?
Just a quick question, maybe a little off topic, but I see the debt service there, and you mentioned IEPA loans. Are the terms and conditions associated with those loans fixed? I mean, it is what it is, or?
It is what it is after we've entered into the loan agreement. There's no refunding or refinancing. So the terms and conditions are set. Now, we do have some leeway when we are entering into that loan to decide how many years do we want to finance it over. And the interest rate is set by the state that we receive on that loan.
Thank you.
Yeah, the interest rate is typically lower than we would receive for a general obligation bond, which is why those loans are very attractive to the city. The next fund, or the enterprise fund, is the parking fund, and this was a fund that the city council just saw a report from the finance committee kind of talking about some of the funding changes to keep this fund self-sustaining. So there was $70,000 budgeted for capital projects in 2024 and $1.2 million in debt service for the parking fund. So the parking fund does pay for all of the capital projects associated with the city's parking lots and parking decks. There is a transfer from the capital improvement fund that pays for the debt service on the bonds previously associated with the Addison parking deck. So that's about $900,000 a year. And one of the things that the Finance Committee and City Council just looked at was using some of the TIF 6 increments. So this is an example of how our TIF funds can help our enterprise funds where it's allowable. So the downtown TIF is going to provide increment to the parking fund to pay for the parking deck repair program and the charging stations. So this provides some additional funding for the parking fund to help keep this fund sustainable. And then all other capital projects are recovered from parking rates and fines. Those rates will be increasing July 1st.
Alderman Hill.
Thank you, Mayor. So that interfund transfer, what is it called?
Correct.
I'm sorry.
Current interfund transfer is correct.
Is that common for enterprise funds? Is that something that we see in other enterprise funds, or is this unique to this particular situation with the parking?
I would say it's not uncommon. So again, it's common to use your TIF funds where applicable to help offset some of your infrastructure costs for your enterprise funds. And you'll see that later in some of the examples for the municipal utility fund as well, where we're using TIF dollars in TIF areas to provide that infrastructure, and that's an allowable TIF expense for the TIF district. It has to be within that TIF district. But then it is an allowable cost that the city can use.
But it's accurate to say with interfund transfer, it's still considered self-sustaining, even though we're transferring from a different fund to.
The fund
Service
is self-sustaining. It's not self-sustaining solely by parking rates, though. I guess that would be the differentiating factor, right? I think with the Addison parking deck and having the capital fund, that was kind of recognizing kind of the city contribution to help provide that parking deck to the community, right? It's not just a commuter or a function of who's parking. There's many different users of the parking system. And so I think that's how the city has used those capital improvement transfers, is to kind of show that there are multiple user groups that benefit from the parking in the downtown. Okay. Yep, there we go. The next set of funds I'm going to talk about are governmental funds, and these are funds that are primarily supported by tax dollars. And these are tax dollars whether they are raised locally, or these are tax dollars where they are raised by the state or federal government and then come down to the city of Elmhurst. I'm going to talk as we go through each fund, the concept of unrestricted versus restricted. And this is kind of important when you get into governmental funds. Unrestricted means the city can do what they want with those revenue sources. We have the flexibility to use those funds for any purpose. There then are restricted funds, and we also have to go into restricted based upon state statute, which is kind of the highest level of restriction, meaning there's an external body that's telling us how we can or cannot spend those funds. Or there's the city restriction, where we have passed an ordinance or we have a policy that has designated us to use those funds in a particular way, but this, by action of the city council, that restriction could be changed. So the city's general fund and capital improvement funds are two of the main funds which help provide support to the city's capital projects. All expenses are paid for by the general fund. The capital fund collects revenues and then makes transfers to the different funds to be able to fund different projects. So think of it like a fund that is collecting revenue, and then it's either distributing it to the general fund for projects that are getting paid for there. I mentioned earlier that it transfers funds to the parking fund to help pay for that debt service. It's really kind of a pass-through fund for the city to fund capital projects.
Can I ask another question? Thanks. So only a pass-through for things that ultimately are capital
Correct.
expenses?
There's no operating costs that are going through that fund. The general fund does provide some funding on its own as well, and I'll go into some specific examples here in a second. Here we are. So some examples of projects that are funded 100% by the Capital Improvement Fund. There were $5.9 million in projects in the 2024 budget that are funded solely by the Capital Improvement Fund. These include things like electrical improvements, building improvements, street and sidewalk programs with some exceptions noted below. The capital improvement fund, as noted here too, pays $13.5 million in debt service. A part of it, $568,000, goes to the MUF, and then just about $900,000, as mentioned earlier, goes to the parking fund. The major revenue sources for the capital improvement fund are the income tax, home real sales tax, and telecommunications tax. Then moving down to projects that are funded 100% by the general fund. There's $3.8 million of projects funded by the general fund. The general fund has many revenue sources, 50 to 60 different revenue sources, so I'm not going to go into all of those, but some of the larger ones are our sales tax, our home real sales tax, our income tax, and property tax. Some projects that are paid for 100% by the general fund in the 2024 budget include our street sealing, our asphalt and concrete patching, our neighborhood traffic study, our vehicles are mostly paid for out of the general fund, with the exception of those that are funded by the MUF or the parking fund.
Can I ask another?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for indulging me. So vehicles are paid by the general fund, but then there are some that are paid by the
MUF or the parking fund.
And are those are those distinctions of what fund they're being paid for by some either municipal or state obligation, or is it us just moving our money around as we may?
So it's based on the use of the vehicle. So for example, the parking enforcement vehicle that's used to enforce parking is paid for by the parking fund, and then any vehicle that would be used in our water, sewer, wastewater operations would be paid for by the MUF.
Got it.
Absent those two, vehicles are paid for by the general fund. And then lastly, there are projects that are funded by a combination where the general fund provides some funding and the capital improvement fund provides some funding. The largest project is our street resurfacing project each year that is shared by both funds. And then IT, software, hardware is another cost that we allocate both between the general fund and the capital fund.
Alderman Hill.
Thank you, Mayor. Why are they funded by a combination? What would that determination?
Right. So, I mean, these are unrestricted funds, so that would just be the city policy and kind of how we have funded these costs. So the street resurfacing and the IT, we could fund them 100% by the general fund. We could fund them 100% by the capital fund. We could change the split between the two. That's just been the city practice of how those costs have been allocated.
So it's like how it's happened over time, like tradition or precedent?
Correct.
More or less? Okay.
Correct.
Thank
Correct.
you.
Yep. The next funds I'm going to talk about are restricted funds. And so I'm going to note with each one kind of what the fund is and whether it's a restriction that the city has placed upon itself or whether it's a restriction by other parties. So the city stormwater fund is internally restricted. So this is a fund that was created by the city. We are the ones that have set forth the restriction to use those revenues for stormwater projects and specifically for stormwater capital projects. The fund is not used for kind of routine maintenance of our stormwater system. So the largest revenue is the home rule sales tax, and there were $2.8 million in projects in the 2024 budget for stormwater. The next fund is the motor fuel tax fund. This is an externally restricted fund. And so there is state motor fuel tax revenues that come into this fund that are restricted by state statute as to what we can spend those dollars on. As an aside, we also have a local motor fuel tax. That tax does not go to this MFT fund. That tax is housed in the general fund. So we receive about $2.5 million annually in MFT revenues. We use about half of the MFT fund for operating expenses and half for capital projects. And by state statute and state restrictions, those capital projects are typically focused more on street improvements.
Alderman Brennan.
So just a quick question with respect to the state-funded tax. So if residents have an electric car, I have one, and I was shockingly surprised how expensive my plates were. And the rationale was that, hey, I'm not paying gas tax, so that's my fair share for, the roads that I'm using, et cetera. Does the city of Elmhurst get any piece of that in lieu of me not buying gas?
I do not believe so. This is solely the motor fuel tax that is collected statewide, and then it gets allocated to the city. It's not based off of motor fuel tax dollars in Elmhurst. It's our allocation of the pool of dollars that are collected at the state. But I do not believe we see any of the tag revenue that would come through as part of this.
Like, there are a lot of electric cars in Illinois. Even a better case, I would love to see us get a piece of that. So, just curious. Thank you.
Proceed, thank you.
And the last group of funds I want to talk about are our tax increment financing funds. So these are externally restricted in that there are certain expenses that we can use these funds for. They have to be eligible by the state TIF statute. And the expenses also have to benefit the TIF district itself. So the 2024 budget includes $35 million in capital projects for our overall TIF district. And in the box at the right of the slide highlights some of the different capital projects that each TIF district is undertaking for the year. So some of the ones that we talked about, like the downtown TIF is doing some utility relocation. Those are things that benefit the municipal utility fund, but all of these projects are within the TIF district or provide benefit to the TIF district.
Thank you.
Alderman Toledo.
Can you please clarify the recent information that we learned about another restriction on the use of TIF related to municipal buildings?
So the TIF law does not allow for use of increment for brand new municipal buildings. It does allow for renovation, but not brand new buildings. And that was a change in state statute a few years ago.
Okay, proceed. Oh, Alderman Jensen.
Thank you, Mayor. What counts as a renovation? You keep one wall, or you have to keep the substantial portion of the building?
I think it depends upon what you're doing, and I think it depends upon case law. But I think, if you can probably keep a majority of it, that would be considered a renovation. But again, it's just based off of, I can't give you an exact answer to that, but.
We can get back to you on
Yeah.
that.
Circle back.
And then the last slide I just included, this is directly from the 2024 CAB. It just highlights, the percent of each fund's participation in the 2024 CAB.
Alderman Hill.
Thank you, Mayor. So I guess my question relates back to what I was saying about precedent and tradition. So I'm seeing, for instance, with street resurfacing, or street sealing, or street improvements, there's three different funds they come out of. So there's a general fund, a combination fund, and then the the
Motor fuel
MFT.
tax, yep.
So it's a little Byzantine to me. Like, how do we know where these?
Right.
Is there any
So some of it's,
structure that would help us figure that out?
yeah, so some of it's based upon, what our policies are and what our practices are. So that's certainly, as we talked about, like the allocation of IT projects and, how we are, how we pay for vehicles as an example. But for projects, I talked about there's unrestricted funds and there's restricted funds. So some of it also depends on where there's available funding in terms of how we prepare the budget every year. So, when the MFT fund has available dollars, we would plan a capital project in the MFT fund. But again, we only have $2.5 million there every year. So you have to probably wait a couple of years till you have enough dollars to do an MFT funded project. Versus, there may be some years where the general fund has more flexibility or the capital fund has more flexibility to participate or fund the different capital projects. And so it becomes, a decision point on how do we prioritize these projects, which Manager Grabowski will get into later, and then how do we fund them? And sometimes there's a couple different funding sources that we can choose from, and sometimes there's only one. It just depends on what the capital project is and what the available revenues are. What we do try to include in the CAB for each project and kind of in a summary is what is the project and where are we proposing that it would be funded from. And so that's something that we provide, in each CAB sheet to try to highlight that. But there are changes and shifts from year to year as projects take different priorities or as the budget comes in differently too. Our revenues either outperform or overperform or look better or look worse in different funds. Another great example, so we had some Build America bond dollars that came into our MFT fund. It was a grant program that the state did a few years ago, provided some MFT dollars, which allowed us to do some more MFT eligible projects in our MFT fund. Those dollars have sunset though, so we won't be able to do as many projects with the MFT fund going forward. And so we'll have to kind of decide, well, where do those projects go and how do we prioritize those with everything else?
There's nothing wrong with using the the restricted funds are restricted.
Correct.
But as the director, of course, said, it's like if you have your home budget and you say one spouse is paying for the mortgage and all the utilities, and the other spouse's paycheck is going for the college fund and for vacation, and then something happens, someone graduates or there's a special trip and you pull funds from one to the other. There's nothing wrong with using that flexibility, but we have certain guideposts of where our funds come from. One kid gets a scholarship, so we don't need as much money. It might free up money for something else. So I think we have some flexibility, but it's not that we just ignore where they're coming from. We kind of move funds depending on the factors that the director has mentioned.
So next we'll move into the debt overview. So the question is, how does the city fund capital projects with debt, which we have to do occasionally? And the analogy I would use, it's like a home mortgage. That debt can be issued to finance large purchases, capital projects, and typically our debt finance projects are larger in scope and amount and are longer lived assets. We'll get into a couple examples in a minute. The debt is repaid over time by those who benefit or utilize the asset, typically 10 to 20 years for the city. When issuing that debt, the city must identify a repayment source for the future debt service, whether that's property tax or TIF dollars, the increment that's gained, sales tax, something like that. And with each bond issue, the city must go through a rating process, which is quite deep and thorough. We're proud to say that the city currently has a AAA bond rating, which is the highest rating possible. So what types of debt does the city have? First is general obligation bonds, or GO bonds as we typically call them. And those are bonds that are issued and backed by the full faith, credit, and taxing authority, which are property taxes of the city. And so we pledge that when we sign on the dotted line, when the city council approves that we will put that on the property tax bill for repayment. So by default, the county clerk then assesses that property tax to pay the annual debt on the GO bonds, and you would see that line on your tax bill. However, the city can abate or remove the property tax levy by passing an abatement ordinance, which we do every year for a number of them. This ordinance tells the county clerk not to raise or levy a property tax to meet the debt service. The abatement ordinance cites that the city has other revenues and sources to pay for the debt service. So the city has abated all bond payments since 2016. From 2009 to 2015, the city did not abate portions of the debt service, and that was due to the impact of the downturn in the economy. And that was a result of the finance task force that came in to Mayor DeCiani and the city council. and we were looking for alternative revenue sources. That was one of them. So for a short time, and that was in the report, for a short time, the recommendation was to not abate those. But then in 2014, the direction of City Council was we need to start abating those again as revenues increased. And so we were able to do that in 2016. We started that again, and we have been able to continue that since then.
I have a question. Sorry.
Alderman Bastido.
So would you say that most cities and villages in Illinois abate all of their bond payments?
I don't know that I can answer that because I don't know the budgets of those communities.
But that's all public information, right? Could we find out? 'Cause
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
You see both. You see both. I don't know which one's more prevalent, but you do see both.
Okay, so if we didn't use funds to abate the bond payments, that would free up more money, right, to spend other places?
You could look at it that way. Most times you wouldn't abate because you don't have that revenue source to pay for that. But you could, I guess you could look at it that way, that you could free up other revenue sources by not abating the bonds and then putting it on the property tax.
Alderman Toledo.
I just wanted to put a fine point on the bullet on slide 18. The city currently has a AAA bond rating, the highest rating possible. That means that the city of Elmhurst can issue debt at the most attractive rate, interest rate, compared to communities that have a less favorable bond rating. So to put it in a nutshell, we get money a very at good interest rates for our capital projects compared to communities that don't have as responsible financial management and as good of a bond rating as we do. So that's a good thing. Because sometimes you see a high rating is bad, but no, the high rating in this case is good because it gets us a low interest rate. Thank you.
Thank you. Continue.
Thank you. Another type of debt that the city has are the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, or IEPA loans. As Director Coyle said earlier, that is at the lowest interest rate possible. That's even better than a GO bond at a AAA rating. That is a revolving loan that the state runs, and it's low-interest loans to fund water, sewer, and wastewater projects in Illinois. The loan availability is subject to funding and award by the IEPA, so it's not an automatic. In the last Bundle 5 project loan application, we were sitting right at the cutoff of where the state had enough funding for us. And fortunately, a project above us decided to postpone, and we were able to fund the Bundle 5. So it was close. We had a lot of discussions internally. How do we deal with this if we don't get the loan? But fortunately, we did get that. That is exclusively held in the municipal utility fund and paid for in the municipal utility fund, and the CERC rates on the city services bill fund repayment of those loans.
Mr. Mayor.
Alderman Nardini.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. What does revolving mean?
So that means as money comes in, the state keeps it in the fund and continues to loan that money out.
Think of your revolving credit card. You know, you have a certain limit, you pay it down, you can borrow it, you know, it comes in and out.
But not us, the state.
Yes. Alderman Brennan?
Thank you. So, City Manager, so what you're saying is that even though the state may be mandating a particular compliance, which I think most our projects are modernizing, but as we're modernizing, we're also making sure we're compliant with new regulations, future regulations, et cetera. It's not guaranteed that we can get a IEPA loan to do that compliance work.
That is correct.
Okay, I didn't know that.
And one of the things that when we did the water rate increase, I was at a meeting of about 15 mayors on Saturday, and we, you know, there were tongue-in-cheek thanking us for being out in the lead because phosphorus reduction is a significant capital cost that we have budgeted for and are starting to engineer for, and they will be right behind us. So as they're saying, it looked maybe to our residents like we have significantly higher rates than other municipalities. I think you'll see them following suit. These are mandates from the state of Illinois that this is what every municipality is going to have to do. We've been out front and addressed it, and they will follow. Okay.
May I, Mr. Mayor?
Alderman Nardini.
Thanks again. To put a fine point on what my Chair Brennan said, so we are obliged by the state to do these. Let me cut to the how many times could the state demand a mandate of us and then not have access to those loans?
One of the big topics, particularly for those who've gone down to Springfield and participated in lobbying our legislators, is what we call unfunded mandates. They could be, and for instance, I believe that body cameras for our police officers even if it wasn't mandated, I think it would be a very wise investment for us, and the police would certainly now agree. But that's an example of an unfunded mandate where they say all police officers, I think it's 2 years from now, have to have body cams. And what's the cost of like $130,000 or? No police officers here tonight. But, yeah, but we will.
Right up.
Right up?
Close to 1 mil.
1 mil. Oh, I was just talking about the tip. So that's an unfunded mandate. So they tell you you need to do it, we do it. Phosphorus is another unfunded mandate. You do it. So it's a constant topic. There are many things that we are mandated to do and don't have the funds. And we can talk about that some other time with local government distributive funds. As we'll talk about later, there's legislation to eliminate the state sales tax on groceries, which will cut our revenues by $1 million. And these are that's not really a mandate. It's just we're not going to get it anymore. And so you'll see a constant theme that answers that question.
Are there tea leaves of knowing when that rotation? I mean, so we would be telling the rates that we just raised on water, had we not gotten any of those loans, we would be telling our citizens that it was, instead of 27, it would be 60%. I mean, without, I'm throwing a number out.
I wouldn't put a
that's
number like
inappropriate.
60 on it, but it would be something higher than that because the interest rate on the bonds that we got would require that.
Or we'd have to defer it, or we'd have to find temporary financing until maybe the next year's IEPA loans came in.
Because the loans are yearly. There is a renewal process each year.
There's a certain amount available each year, and
Right. We're scheduled for a certain time period to pay it back, 10 or 20 years, and that's how long we have each year to pay that back. We'll get into a schedule in just a little bit. Another good point about the IEPA loans is that we don't start accruing interest until the project is closed out. So as Director Coyle used an example earlier this morning when we were talking about it, that with a bond issue, a GO bond, we sign the paperwork, they send us the money, we have it sitting in the bank. We start paying interest on it right away. With an IEPA loan, as certain portions of a project are done, we pay for it, the city, then we apply to the IEPA to get reimbursed for that, and we keep that money in our bank, and then when the project is done, completed and closed out, we start accruing interest on that. And we start paying at that point as well.
Thanks.
Alderman Brennan.
Thank you. So, City Manager, just one follow-up question to your comment that you made. So, with the Bundle 5, let's say, for example, there was no IEPA dollars. You said that you're looking at, what's our plan B, C, et cetera. One of the options, would it have been potentially delaying Bundle 5 for a year and hope that the following year
That
We get
was in consideration, yes.
Okay, thank you.
But as we know, delaying projects tends to accrue more expense.
Understood, thank you.
The last type of debt that the city has is a line of credit, and that is with a local bank that we negotiate for 2-year periods, 3-year, 2-year periods. We use that exclusively by internal city policy for the city's TIF funds. We can draw down and repay the line of credit as needed and should be repaid with future TIF increment. The TIF term is finite and the line of credit must be repaid. So just to keep that in mind, if the TIF ends, line of credit due does not go away. We need to still pay that back. Of course, we look at projections when we look at taking any kind of a line of credit draw as to how we're going to pay that back. So next, we want to talk about the city's debt limit. The city has an internal policy to limit our general obligation bonds to 5% of the city's EAV. It aligns with a state statute for non-home rule communities. And right now, our limit equates to $149 million of debt. That's the cap that we've self-imposed. Current GO bonds outstanding at the end of 2023 were a total of $72.5 million, so well below the self-imposed debt limit of $149. But the debt limit does not take into consideration any other debt other than the GO bonds. So it does not include the IEPA loans of $37.6 million, which are repaid by the sewer and water rates, and it does not take into account the line of credit either, and we'll get into that in just a minute.
So just to be clear, if you're non-home rule, the state statute says you can only go up to 5% of your equalized assessed valuation. We're not bound by that because we are home rule, but we have self-imposed that limit for as long as I can remember. Alderman Bram.
Thank you. Excuse me. Director Coyle, I know you've worked in other communities. I don't know if you know off the top of your hand, but off the top of your head, other home rule communities, do they have a policy in regards to their debt percentage? And if so, is it typically just matching what the state says, 5%, or is it higher or lower, if you have any of that info?
So I would say most communities that are active in the debt markets and that are getting rated do have a debt policy, because that's something that S&P or Moody's would look at and ask that you have when you go through that rating process. I do not know specifically whether communities have a higher or lower rate, and I couldn't say that I've surveyed them, but I would, I think the reason in many situations where we've held ourselves to the non-home rule standard is just to align ourselves kind of with that state statute that's set forth. But having the policy is probably the more important thing, but I would imagine there are some variances out there in what the limits are.
Is there a rationale or a reason behind not including in that number IEPA loans, et cetera?
So the city could certainly pass its own policy on what we wanted, our total debt load to be. The reason why the debt limit is set to EAV is for general obligation bonds. As Manager Grabowski stated earlier, those are repaid by property taxes, by the full faith and credit of the city's property taxing ability. And so that's why the debt limit specifically for GO bonds aligns with EAV, because basically this is how much you could tax your residents to be able to repay your debt. So you'll also notice that the larger communities typically also have higher ratings because they have a higher ability, a higher EAV to repay bonds with, because they have a higher taxing ability based on that higher EAV. So that's why the EAV or percent of EAV is used for GO bonds. But you could set a policy for, IEPA loans and use some metric that would say, we want our IEPA or our total debt burden for our IEPA loans. We would probably look at, the MUF fund and what would be a metric that would make sense there to kind of have that policy. Something you could do.
Alderman Nardini?
Thank you again. You just mentioned that a higher EAV is something that affects our credit rating. Does our percentage of GO bond percentage, if it were higher, would it be a negative effect on our credit rating?
So yes, one of the things they look at, they look at the city holistically, right? So they look at our ability, what is our capacity? They also look at what our debt outstanding is, not only our general obligation bonds, but they would also be looking at our IEPA loans, our line of credit, our pension debt. They would look at us holistically. What are our assets? What are our liabilities? What is our financial position? To kind of holistically look at that.
Thanks.
Oh, I thought I was going to beat Alderman Toledo to this, but I think she's going to go ahead and say it.
Oh, do you want to, let's
No,
see.
please, please.
I was just going to say, if anyone wants some interesting reading, you can read the rating reports from past bond issues. And it's very, actually, I think everyone that lives in Elmhurst should read it at least once, because it really shows what someone from a financial perspective outside of our community, who look at lots of communities every single day, how they look at Elmhurst and how they rate Elmhurst's financial stability. It's a couple of pages long, and it's, I think, very insightful and interesting to understand that perspective. Is that what you're going to say?
It's close. I would add that in my tenure here, the Finance Committee has looked at total debt on occasion, especially when we're doing a bond issue or a loan. And that question does come up of, well, what's our total debt, not just our GO bond debt? So anybody here who's been on the Finance Committee knows that that is a routine conversation that we have.
I would just add 2 points. One is the non-inclusion of the IEPA loans would be the same in non-home rule communities, so we're not doing something different. The other one is the rating for our credit is not really very different than your own credit rating. Like when you go to take out a loan for your mortgage, and they look at how much other debt do you have, stability of employment, income. So it's an objective set of criteria. Thank you. That would be used to come up with our credit rating.
Thank you, Mayor. So this is a graphic presentation of our debt limit. The gray shaded area is the debt limit of 5%. You see it's projected for 2024 and 2025 because we only have it up until the end of 23. But the blue line would be our GO debt. And important after 2022 to look at, that's without the library debt that fell off, or was repaid, I should say, when it didn't fall off. But it was repaid at the end of 2022. And then the projections of our blue line also take into account the future possibility of capital projects.
And I did ask Director Coyle before this, because I want to be clear. So if the library, we're not a district, they're part of the city government, even though we have not total control over what they do or fund, but their debt is included in the 5% cap.
Mayor.
Alderman Brennan.
So the spike from 2024 to 2025, is there a list of those projects from a KEB perspective that are driving that increase?
So those are based off of the KEB. The major project that would be in 2025 would be the police station, which was put in there. Yep.
Thank you.
City Manager.
Thank you. We did look at total debt to answer the questions of, do we look at that in this next slide? And the reason that the bar chart fades at 2024 is because those are projected numbers. As we move forward with the wastewater treatment plant projects, the water reservoir projects, the capital projects that Director Coyle just talked about. And so the teal line, I'll call it, bar chart would be our GO debt, our general obligation debt. The purplish blue is the IEPA loans, and then the maroon and then lighter, almost like an orange or salmon, are the combined numbers as we move forward.
Hill's got a question.
I'm sorry, I
So-
couldn't see. Alderman Hill, sorry.
So, looking at this, and it doesn't have a legend, so I'm going to mangle the numbers here, but it looks like to avoid that 5% debt limit, we have, depending on the year, going from 2025 forward, between 30 to maybe 60 million in a spread of potential GO bond funding we could take on to avoid that 5% debt limit. I mean, if we were so inclined to do that.
Yeah, I don't have the exact numbers, but we do have some room underneath the 5% EAV cap.
And then just to reiterate, so I understand correctly, the current GO bond levels that I'm seeing in 2024, based on earlier slide, we abate all those debt service payments.
That's correct.
So would we continue to be able to do that if we increased our GO bond obligations significantly going forward, above what we see here? Because this is based off the KEB, correctly?
Correct.
If I'm correct.
That's
right?
correct.
Well, just to be clear, the salmon color, if you will, that's not within the 5% cap. It's
Correct.
just the light purple, we'll call it.
Not quite a salmon, Mayor. I'd have to
Well,
disagree
for
with
the
you. but-
restaurant guy over there. All right.
Right, of course.
Alderman Bastido?
So just confirming, you combine them just so we can see that the debt is increasing, not because, I mean, you said our self-imposed limit, but also the state-imposed limit for non-home rule units don't take into account the IEPA loans. That was just for us to see that the total is going up?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
City Manager.
Thank you. So now we'll get into some numbers. Total current debt that is outstanding for the city. You see the numbers here, total future debt service on the far right. As I said, the line of credit we talked about earlier, that's about $5,225,000 right now, outstanding. It needs to be paid back. Of note, it does not include Bundle 5 IEPA loan because we have not started the payments on it.
Alderman Brennan.
So the line of credit, if I recall, what is that line of credit? It's like 12 million? Is it
10, isn't it? It's 10 million.
10 million? Thank you.
Here's a look at the city's future debt service obligations. That includes principal and interest on outstanding bonds and IEPA loans. As I said previously, it does not include the IEPA loan for Bundle 5 because drawdowns of the funds have not begun. And then the line of credit was not included as debt service is not fixed. And as I said on the last slide, we have 5.2 million outstanding in the line of credit.
Alderman Toledo.
When would the Bundle 5, what year on this chart? Because I think, some people might look at this and say, oh, 2028, like, we see kind of a step down and then 2029. But because Bundle 5 will roll on, I think maybe 2027-ish. So meaning like our total P&I, what looks like it might like kind of ease up, actually is going to have another layer added on top of it. Do you know what year Bundle 5 is expected to begin?
So it'll begin a little bit this year. Sorry, hold on, I've got that here. I believe it's 2026 or 2027. But let me see if I can find the schedule here that I've got that on. If I don't. Sorry.
So that might be like another million or so in principal and interest annually.
I believe it was more than that. I believe it was a little over a million. Oh, here we go.
2 million,
It's about 2.1 million annually in debt service. for
starting
bundle.
around
2026, 2027,
Okay.
and based on project
So those
completion.
$10 million numbers will be more like a $12 million number.
Correct.
And the 9 and the 8s will be 10 and,
Correct.
or like 9, 10, 11, and 10. Okay.
Correct.
Just wanted to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Good point.
Sorry.
Alderman Brennan.
So off the top of your head, do you know what 2023 was as far as total P&I?
For, what the total P&I was
Yeah.
in 2023?
That's fine. We can move on. I can look it up later. That's fine.
And then my final slide here are a breakout of that debt service obligation by source. So broken out by the CIF, the Stormwater Fund, the MUF, and the Parking Fund. And you can see where some of those projects are paid off into the future. And with that, I will turn it back to Christina to talk about our reserve policies.
So reserve policies are policies that the city has set itself, which really talk about how much should we retain in the different funds for varying purposes. So reserve policies protect the city against unforeseen circumstances, whether that would be shortfalls in revenues or, unforeseen expenses. A balanced budget is a budget that maintains the reserve policy for that particular fund. So one of the things that we're asked every year is what do we consider to be a balanced budget? What are we delivering if we're delivering a balanced budget or city council is passing a balanced budget? It's a budget that adheres to those reserve policies that we have set forth. One note here, so sometimes when we're trying to look at every year, how do we fund projects and how do we balance the budget? Sometimes capital projects are often the things that are easier to move between years or to reduce or to eliminate to close gaps in the budget as compared to operating expenses that recur year after year. So just going over some of the reserve policies, not all funds in the city have a reserve policy, but those that do are highlighted here. So the general fund has a reserve policy of to keep the reserve between 25 to 33% of operating expenses. And one note that I added here, so we have exceeded our reserve policy. So the city has been mindfully spending down our reserves as part of the budgeting process. So one of the examples, two reasons for that. One, we received the ARPA dollars, the federal grant dollars, which helped improve our fund balance. We've also been in a very we've seen good revenue performance from our sales tax and our income tax and our home rule sales taxes, which have helped, kind of beat our budget projections and provided an environment where we can have a reserve that's above policy, but we are continuing to spend that down. Our current 2024 budget does project, based on that budget at that time, that we would be hitting that 25% floor. Now, if things come in better, our revenues are improved over what we budget, that may not happen, but that's where we're projected to end 2024 based off of the prior budget process. The MFT fund has a policy to have a reserve of 15% of our MFT taxes that we receive. And then our MUF fund has a reserve of 25% of operating expenses. This is something that we look at when we do our rate studies and our rate modeling and past rates. So this is something the MUF fund is currently not at that operating reserve level, but that's something that we've been mindful of and we've looked at as we've looked at our rates that we are increasing. How do we kind of work towards getting to that reserve level? And all other funds that are not here do not have a specific reserve policy.
Thank you, Christina. So as we get into the future and how we move forward, question is, what tools do we use to add projects to the KEB and to prioritize? So we look at our studies and our master plans, like the water and sewer master plan, our stormwater studies, our pavement condition reports. We look at the city strategic plan, and then we look at the assessment of capital assets by our city staff to understand where things fall.
And by that last one, you're talking about what assets need repairs and replacements, is that?
Correct.
Thank you.
Mayor, sorry.
Oh, Alderman Bastido.
So looking at this slide, I mean, I think this is helpful for city council to see, because it's not so much conversations that are happening, what's happening in meetings. The way city council can influence the KEB is this, ahead of time, is this strategic plan.
Correct.
Okay,
That's one method, yep.
thank you.
Alderman Bram.
Thank you. Touching on the previous slide, if I understood Director Coyle correctly, it was the decision of the council and/or the staff in regards to spending down the general fund from above 33% to 25% reserves?
I can speak to that, yes. That was, I think, at a budget committee of the whole meeting where we started talking about the reserves, and it depends on how conservative a person is. Staff tends to be more conservative, would love to see that fund balance more towards the 33%, but the city council was very deliberate in saying, no, we think 25% is more appropriate.
Okay. I just needed clarification on that. I mean, my personal feeling is that I would go more, I guess, along with staff, wanting it to be higher, especially in these economic times, if we can afford to do so. And that's obviously the biggest decision there. But, all right, thanks for that clarification.
All right. Alderman Toledo.
I'll just make a comment on that. I don't exactly remember the conversation per se, but one thing to note, and it goes both ways. City manager mentioned that city staff tends to be conservative in how they budget. And what that means is they project things to cost more than they might end up costing. And what that results in is oftentimes our budget expects us to be within the policy range or below the policy range. But in reality, when we finish that budget year, we are above the policy range. And so you may think it's good, you may think it's bad, but we tend to, and have, since I've served on this council, come in above the projections for the policy range goal. That's a conservative approach. It's better than being aggressive and always falling short, for sure. But it is something that is a consistent within our budgeting process. And so, Alderman Bram, when you talk about being like up on the upper range, like, I don't think anyone's good enough to be between 33 and 25. Like, that's, it's more of kind of how every single line item is built and how it ends up influencing where we expect to come in and then where reality actually happens.
Well, let me follow up because you're chair of budget. I mean, we were significantly above the 33, and there was a policy decision to start spending it down to bring us within the range.
Correct.
And, we use it because we could have raised taxes to fund it, or we could spend down because we were above the range. But I don't think, if you were projecting, Director, where we would wind up on December 31, 2024, would you say that we're going to be, you want to answer that one? We could talk about something else.
I was going to say, if I was that great at predicting, I'd be at my chalet in the south of France right now. But, right now our revenues are performing, at or better than our major ones are performing well. So, likely if the trend continues, we will fare well, but we still.
But we'll be in the range.
We'll be in the range,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Absent some other unforeseen circumstance. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, and thank you. Alderman Bram.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I wanted that clarification, because I thought I heard the words that we, the city as a whole, is purposely spending down the general fund to that 25% limit. I'm not saying that's where we'll come in. More than likely, as Alderman Toledo already stated, right, we are very conservative in budgeting. You know, us in Public Works probably spend, or not probably, we spend the most money here. And there's a lot of time, not all the time, but a lot of the time that we are under the budget line item. Then there's some of those times that we're not. But with that said, I just wanted to understand there has been an intent to spend down, per the budget wise, to that 25% of the operating expenditures.
I just want to ask, I need to clarify, are we spending down to 25 or spending down to get within the range?
So our policy is to be within the range.
Correct.
I would say the way the 2024 budget was prepared, if you would look at the budget document, we were just above the 25% limit based upon what the 2024 budget
But
was.
with the conservative budgeting, it's quite, we would expect it could be more, 25.
We would
26,
hope.
20. Right, all right. I think we're beating that horse pretty well. All right. Continue.
Alderman Hill.
Alderman Hill.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm not going to talk about that slide. I was going to talk about the previous slide, slide 32, because I think it's important, as I just heard Noah earlier, that there's no, it took me a while to understand this, but if I do understand it correctly by reading the slide, other than the city strategic plan, which is then articulated by staff, there's no direct process for the council or committee to put something on the KEB.
I think we're a step ahead. Well, you can, go ahead.
Well, you could use the referral process, I suppose, as well, to directly influence that.
And that's my understanding of it, so is that just,
I guess we should have had that on there.
I think it's later.
Okay.
so that should be, okay, so that would be another method by which we can do that too, which I think is what we've done, you know, with some projects, but typically they don't get on there that way, correct, with the KEB?
I'm sorry, Alderman?
They don't really follow that path nominally, right? The projects on the KEB they're typically articulated by city staff or through the strategic plan or through a city review of a need.
Yes, in our day-to-day operations, as we look at, as an example, the wastewater treatment plant, and we go through that, the water and sewer master plan, that is suggested by staff that we need to take a look at that, or the police station, looking at space study for that. So those are examples I would use as both studies and master plans and the strategic plan, where those projects have been included in the KEB.
And we should, so how it gets on there is one thing, but one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because when it gets, so they wind up as being something under consideration in the capital plan, and then the policy of how much we want to spend, staff tells us what they intend, but I think we'll have a little bit more robust capital discussion this year as we talk about, well, here's a number of priorities because we have some significant capital projects and the council will have to decide, well, which ones do we want to pay for? Because we've looked at, whether it's sidewalks, lead pipe removal, train station, police station, do we want to fund them all at once? And Chair Toledo has said maybe they have to be staggered out. And so there may be a need to discuss. Personally, the police station's a higher priority to me than the train station. But if there's, $20 million in grants that are going to go away because we make that a number 2 priority, then I would look at them differently. But when we go into that discussion, I want people to have the benefit of knowing all of the things we're talking about. So we're not, I guess, technically, as a council, putting things on the capital budget, putting it on the table to decide what's going to be consumed first. But we will have a say in, and we could put additional things on, but I think we have to make sure that we are spending the dollars in our priority order. Alderman Toledo.
Sorry, I feel like I'm talking too much tonight, but my view of a successful project series of projects that came onto the capital plan that really wasn't necessarily originally initiated by staff is our stormwater projects. I mean, the stormwater projects were really resident-led in that there was a need, an awareness and a need for those to happen. And then the council heard the people they represented, that got put onto the strategic plan, that then got put onto a capital plan, that then led to operating budgets and actual projects, dirt, shovels in the ground. So, I think there's lots of different ways that can happen, but I think the stormwater projects and the scope of that was really, a resident-led initiative from the very beginning. My 2 cents.
With inflation, that'd be a nickel. All right. City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor. So our internal KEB preparation process starts with me issuing a memo to staff on the KEB preparation. The departments then prepare and submit their individual KEB sheets to the finance director and the finance department. The city budget committee, who is made up of myself, Assistant City Manager Johnson, Director Coyle, and our Assistant Finance Director, Ryan, to meet with the departments to discuss all of the submitted KEB sheets. And then in consultation with the department directors, we look at the projects that are in the KEB, priorities, which we'll get into in a minute. Finance then compiles all the KEB sheets and prepares the summary schedules, and it is presented to City Council. So as I said, during those meetings, we look at all the expenditure classifications, which I'm not going to go into detail unless anybody wants to talk about it, and then also the expenditure priority. And those can move from year to year, and I think, Mayor, that's probably something that we'll get into a little bit more as we move forward in the KEB process.
But just to clarify, the expenditure classifications are not in priority order. They're just a classification. The A, B, C, D on the right, those are the priorities.
Thank you. And so here is our tentative 2025 KEB schedule. You see it starts on June 1st, as Mayor said. Seems like it's right around the corner. We look at all the sheets throughout the summer. We draft and distribute that to the City Council by August 15th, and our plan is to present to City Council on August 19th. And then we'll have discussion after that as far as how the expenditures will be slated in there. So as far as feedback on the KEB, we discuss it at several city meetings, starting with my presentation, then committee meetings, committee of the whole meetings on the budget, including the operating budget, and can always submit questions or comments to the city manager, which is how I end my presentation on August 19th. And then Director Coyle pointed out to me, as you were asking the question, Alderman Hill, and I apologize for that, that City Council may add or remove a project from the KEB through the referral process. So that's where it's in the presentation.
So I would also add that I would expect that Public Works will be spending a little bit more time this year in its work on the KEB, and I know Finance always does a thorough job and may have a little bit more work to do. Alderman Hill.
Thank you. City Manager, have you seen a project removed from the KEB through the referral process?
I don't know that I've ever seen one removed through a referral process.
What would be an example of a scenario where that would happen? I mean, you don't have to use any of our examples, but I mean, like, what would that look like?
Yeah, I'm going to have to get back to you. Nothing comes to mind right now, but let us think on that one.
I think the point it could be.
I wasn't aware of that. I just had not heard of that before personally, so that's very interesting. Thank you.
Alderman Bram.
Alderman Hill, I'll say that in my 21 years, I've never seen it done. Not saying it's not possible. I guess Alderman Hill is busy. But I've never seen it done. It is possible, just like you can do anything in the referral process. What I have seen done when we're talking about, the capitals and that capital expenditures and the whole budget process, it could be added or deleted at that point, or a lesser priority at that point, right? We can make a motion to make it a lower priority. Again, I don't recall that ever being done, but it is part of the referral process.
Let me take a stab. I might be off, but I remember when we were talking about the York Prairie Path underpass, I think we had about $1 million in capital for that project. And
Correct.
I was chair of PAS. I took over for Chair Healy, and after a lot of debate, we decided that we did not, even though we had maybe $2 million in grant funds, that we did not want to spend $1 million in our capital. Am I off? Or it might have been operating, but I think it was capital.
Yeah, it was capital, and as I recall, that was a formal vote of the city council. It was an
Right.
ordinance because there were grant funds that were allocated to the city.
Yeah.
That we turned back.
All right. Alderman Irby.
Thank you, Mayor. Just to put a little bit more detail into what Alderman Bram and Alderman Hill are working on with those comments. The KEB is a 5-year process has 5 separate years of budgets that total down to 60 million, 49 million, whatever that number is. If there was a referral that came out to try to knock an item off, well, that item would actually be potentially, if we spent money 5 years out, or, X, take 5 divided by, or the 100 million divided by 5 years, and we had a $20 million hit that added up to the 100 million, it sounds like that referral would remove the whole 100 million in my little example here. Would there be a possibility to have a referral that says, all right, we want to move that first 20 million and start it out 3 years from now and not remove it from the KEB, because it's still in the 5-year period of a KEB, which is, for me, somewhat arcane, because, budgeting and projects go more than 5 years. Strategic plans in Japan go 100 years. I'm not saying we go to a 100-year KEB, but the point is, how can we control the timing of these massive projects rather than kill them through a referral?
We did that, for instance, with the new police station. It was on the docket for 2017. We had this thing called COVID, which you might remember, and then so it was deferred. I don't know that we had to have a referral, but it was a discussion at finance and staff saying we can't afford to do this project now, so it was deferred until maybe next year, the year after, from where we are now. But city manager, that's one example.
Yeah, I agree with the mayor and what Alderman Bram said, that during the budget process, I recall times where the council has said, I'm not sure that we can do that right now, so we will push it out a year, and that's why the KEB is not by any means etched in stone. It's a very flexible document where projects move back and forth depending on the opportunity of grants or funding that didn't come in, or a global pandemic or something like that.
Right. I just remember as a follow-up response, the last budget meeting, it didn't seem like we had a whole lot of appetite to even move anything. It seemed like it was just presented, and it was a train with no brakes. So where did I miss where we can apply some brakes during that process?
Mr. Mayor?
That was my take as a newbie, but
Alderman Bram.
Yeah, I think there's opportunity just because it wasn't done and hasn't been done. I don't know many examples that it has been done, but the budget process, you can make that recommendation, right? It can happen there. It can happen in the referral process as well. An example that I was just thinking of, and I hope this doesn't happen, we have millions or tens of millions of dollars for the train station. If all those grant dollars went away tomorrow, some of the council might want to continue the train station because it's a priority for them. Others might not want to because those are big dollars, or for whatever the reason is. So they might want to put in a referral and say, okay, we're removing this, you know, for the time being, for whatever, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years down the road until we have a bigger appetite for that. So both of those are avenues. Just because it wasn't done doesn't mean it can't be done. And that's what I think where you're going. Any member of the council could say, I don't know how we would make that ordinance, but we could say that we don't want to start the whatever metro station for another 10 years. And you can make that recommendation, and I believe that would be part of the budget ordinance, and it would push it out. But the budget is just a planning document, and that's where, you know, it is kind of tough when we talk about what projects, big projects, especially in the budget document. You kind of are like, well, let's get the additional data and info when it goes through the committee process to determine yes or no. Just because it's in there doesn't mean it's being spent, and just because it's in there for those years doesn't mean it's going to be spent on those years.
I think that's a good example, and I think we're getting a little hung up on the referral, because if it's in there, and as you say, if the train station grants went away, I don't know that anyone would say we should spend $42 million on a new train station. Maybe we would, maybe we wouldn't, but in the budget process, we'd say it's in the budget, but we're not going to start the train station and spend it without the grants. So there's no referral to take it out. Just in the budget process, we wouldn't fund it.
Right.
And that could easily happen. All right. I think that's the end of the presentation.
That
We're in
wraps
the
it up for
Q&A.
us.
Any additional questions? I have, I think, just one. We have a $25,000 level of where it goes in the capital budget. I think it's been that for my entire time on the council. Is that, do you know when if you do you know when that was last adjusted?
We talked about that internally at the last CAB, and the question was, does that need to be adjusted as we did the purchasing manual? And we didn't see a reason to do that. I think we did extend out the time, though, what I recall. I thought it was 5 years, and we kind of extended that to 10, but it has been that as long as I've been here as well. But we can look at that.
Well, I don't know.
If there's a
If
need.
the finance committee wants to look at it, they can. It just occurred to me it's been there for about at least 20 years, so. Additional questions or any questions? All right, well, I want to thank you, staff, for the presentation. This is complex stuff, and I think this will help us as we move forward in our next budget year. And with that, I will ask for a motion to adjourn. Alderman Brennan?
Nobody wants to leave.
I was going to say, Alderman Hill with a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. We're adjourned. Thank you.